Welcome to BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT. My name is Brian Runciman. We're starting today the first in a series of Key Insights webinars for BCS members. This one's about our recent Diversity in IT report. We hear an awful lot about the skills shortage today, and really the thrust of the report that we produced is about the fact that we have a ready-made resource, really, to fill in some of those gaps if we would just paid a little bit more attention to the issues of diversity around gender and age, ethnicity, and the like. So today we're going to be speaking to our internal expert on the subject. At the end, we'll be running a Q&A session, which you're quite welcome to send questions into. If you're using this on the embedded GoToWebinar software, there's a little drop-down marked questions where you can just fill in your questions, and when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll just take a selection of those and put them to our speaker. If you want to put questions to us directly through email, you can email me, director@bcs.org. If you so desire, I'll be keeping an eye on that. It's probably easier to go to webinar, but as you prefer, please do. Also, at the end, after we've finished addressing some of the questions, we've already had some in fact, we will be producing a follow-up blog, which perhaps our speaker will do for us, or we'll certainly put together here, with further resources to carry on this conversation. So let's just set the scene as to why we're having this. A few years ago, not so long ago, a chap called James Damore produced a memo which became very famous in all circles really in IT, because he drew attention to what he thought were the differences between men and women in terms of being represented in tech and leadership. And he was accused of sexism. He lost his job quite quickly, as no doubt you're aware. That seemed a fairly open and shut case. The reactions were very interesting in the issues of diversity. There was a lot of polarization. WikiLeaks, for example, offered James a job. Some people started posting on various social media websites, never complained to HR, and nothing ever happens. One of the geek views that was expressed was this: can we go back to the time when Silicon Valley was about nerds? That is why I applied to Google. This industry used to be a safe place for people like us. Well, that's not a very diverse view, and certainly not one we endorse, but those views came out in the aftermath of this event. The Google employee reaction generally was a lot better than that. Here's a little quote from the commenter: "The internal response ranges from anger and disgust to sadness." Google, well, they, as we know, terminated James Damore's employment. In fact, just in the last couple of days, that's been upheld as being a valid response. This is their view of the memo. Much of the memo is fair to debate, alongside principles of equal employment and anti-discrimination laws, which is a nuanced view. And one of the things that's come out of our research is that we need a lot more nuance in the discussions of these issues. So add to a little bit more of that nuance. It came out not so long after that James Damore is on the autistic spectrum, which casts his comments perhaps in a different light. It doesn't excuse them, but it now becomes part of a conversation about the issues of diversity in IT. So let me introduce our speaker, having done some scene setting there. I'd like to introduce you to Naseer Ahmad. He's our Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager here at BCS.
Thank you, Brian. Welcome to the webinar, and thank you for participating into this important discussion around this inequality, diversity, inclusion, and all these very important discussions that are happening around, in particularly in the engineering sector, and particularly in terms of participation of excluded groups, particularly women and minorities and disabled people. We launched our Diversity in IT report last November, and it was one of the first reports that we launched that looked at diversity in a kind of wider sense than before. And it looks at how well women, disabled people, people from minority communities, and people who are over 50 doing in the IT profession. Now, looking at some of the kind of demographics to start with, the key findings from the report that we published were as follows. Um, Now, the society demographics, as most of you probably know, 50% of the population um, are women within the society, people with disabilities, 23%, people over 50, 45%, and minority communities constitute about 12% of the British population. Now, compare that to the representation of these groups within the IT industry. Only 17% of women are IT specialists. People with disabilities, only 8%, 20%, 21% people from the older age group, and 17% from Black and ethnic minority communities. Now, that is not a very good reflection of the demographics across the population, with the exception of minority communities who seem to be doing slightly better than their representation within the general population. But when we start digging a bit deeper, which I'll do in a while, that representation has also issues in terms of some of the participation in particular areas of IT profession. Now, looking at the workforce and inclusion of these groups within the IT workforce. IT specialists from minority groups, and I'm kind of grouping all these four groups into minorities. Obviously, if you look at all of these four groups, they form majority of the population rather than minority. But just for sake of argument, let's use the minority as a label. Um, uh, IT specialists from minority groups are more likely than others to be in non-permanent employment, and that actually is a major issue. And then they are more than twice as likely to be in temporary positions because they can't get permanent employment for various reasons. Also, IT specialists from minority groups are generally more likely than others to be self-employed, and this is particularly the case for older workers in IT and people, for example, who are 50 plus. Once they lose jobs, they find it very hard to then regain employment within the IT sector, so they go into self-employment. Also, minority groups are less likely than other workers to be employed in small and medium-sized and micro-sized enterprises or tech businesses. And this is particularly the case for women in IT. So they find themselves mostly employed in small-sized enterprises. And so the larger organizations have less representation of women, generally speaking. Also, people from non-white backgrounds are more than twice as likely as their white counterparts to be in part-time employment as a result of their being unable to find full-time work. Um, and lastly, IT specialists earn 36% more per week, which is a positive thing, 36% more per week than employees as a whole. And those from minority groups are more highly paid still. However, earnings for female IT workers are 11% below that of males, and earnings for disabled IT specialists are 13% below those without disabilities. Now that was the kind of this scene for employment. Now let me just look at before I come to the cross sector comparison, just briefly looking at the kind of the educational attainments and requirements within the IT profession. Um, Around 70% of all IT specialists have a higher education level qualification, rising to 87% for those from ethnic minorities. So that means they are generally better qualified in comparison to general population. Among those with disabilities, the proportion is much lower, though only 59%. While 17% of IT specialists hold an IT degree, the figure among minority groups is lower. So they've got higher education level qualifications, but they don't have the degree level qualification, which will put them a lot more at advantage in terms of competing for IT specialist roles. The overall match between levels of skills held and needed by IT specialists is lower than the workplace norm, which is 63% compared to 68%, and is lower still among minority workers in IT. The overall specialists from minority groups are less likely to find work through contacts with existing staff than others in IT positions. So what that says is that basically that a lot of recruitment is done through word of mouth and existing contacts within IT sector. And if you're not in that circle of contacts, then you're not going to be getting employment within the IT sector. Now, just looking at the table on the screen, the cross-sector comparison. This shows the employment levels within the various sectors and compared with IT specialists. And if you look at the column for females, the best employment among females is among nurses and doctors and teachers. And civil engineering is probably the worst one, and IT is the second worst, so only 17%. With disabled people, again, IT is among the lowest sectors employing disabled people. I think doctors are probably the worst one in that league in terms of employment of people with disabilities. People from Black and ethnic minority communities, again, IT is doing slightly better, followed by accountants who are doing a bit better, and doctors who are the best in terms of employing people from Black and ethnic minority communities. Older people, again, IT is among the lowest employers of people from the older age group, followed by police. So that the police probably is the worst comparison, I guess. And looking at the last column, taking the whole of the minority groups together, again, IT becomes slightly better than, say, civil engineering and police, but it's nowhere near comparison to NHS and nursing or teaching profession or the legal profession. Now, so that's the comparison. So what shall we do about what can we do about this situation? What I say is that we need, as a profession, to be much more clued up about the whole of the equality and diversity agenda, particularly when it comes to recruitment. There are a lot of issues in process of recruitment that needs to be looked into, particularly where people are being interviewed, the way people are being selected, i.e. shortlisted. We need to be aware of the subtle biases and prejudices that can actually seep into those areas. So we need to be aware of those subtle biases, and we all have subtle biases, the unconscious prejudices that we all hold. So we need to be aware of them when we are in the process of recruitment. We also need to avoid stereotyping people, because we need to consider people as individuals rather than lump them together into particular groups of people and stereotypes, which can also act to exclude people from employment or promotions within the employment. Also, the process of employment has to be very transparent, and and we need to guard against unconscious bias. We need to have inclusive teams and decision-making processes, so the people who are working and part of our teams need to feel that they have ability to make decisions within the organization and get those decisions listened to, and have the ability to be promoted and given challenging positions within the organization. And as managers, we need to be aware of those things and involve people from all backgrounds in decision making, because that is quite important for inclusion purposes. Now, just to conclude, IT sector is doing slightly better than some of the engineering sectors, generally speaking, but not so well when it comes to some of the sectors like NHS, for example. However, the unemployment rates are high among IT specialists from disabled communities, older people, and from ethnic minorities, and particularly some groups of ethnic minorities. And we need to be looking out for these people to ensure that we don't actually waste that talent, which is so desperately needed within the IT sector, because it is a growing sector. It needs a lot of skilled labor, and we are wasting a lot of talent by overlooking those people from those groups. Thank you for listening, and that's the conclusion of my brief chat. And we are looking forward to having questions from people who might have any comments or questions that they would want us to respond to.
Thank you very much, Naseer. Thank you very much. So that was a fascinating insight. There's a lot more detail in the report itself, isn't there? But
yes, definitely.
Let's address some of the questions that have come in. So we had a question from Nick Holt, who's a fellow of BCS. They've gone straight for the big question, really. He says the gender imbalance kicks in progressively from an early age, and then does so with a vengeance post 16. Why is that?
I suppose it's an issue that actually impacts industry generally, and particularly the STEM sector, i.e. the engineering sector generally, that the way schools and parents actually treat children and kind of guide them into certain kind of career paths. Generally speaking, girls are excluded from those kind of engineering and science subjects, not deliberately, but kind of the way they are stereotyped, and that actually then continues through the education process all the way to university level, and progressively we lose them to other subjects like I don't know, arts and other softer subjects as it were.
Yeah.
And the science subjects are dropped significantly more by girls than boys as they move from GCSE to A levels.
So how do you think targets implement schools' recommendations of A-level subjects and degree courses to their students? Does that have an effect, the fact that schools have these targets too?
It doesn't seem to be having a huge impact at the moment. I think that the whole the system needs to change in a sense to the way we educate children. Maybe we need to look at how we can actually make those science subjects more attractive to girls at a very early age, and then stop stereotyping them.
Yeah,
I think that's really important.
Nick says this: when I first started in the IT industry almost 50 years ago, the gender balance was far, far better than it is today. How and why did that change?
Oh, that's a tough one.
That's broad.
It is very broad, and the IT sector has changed tremendously. I mean, it is transformed completely, and there could be million and one different reasons for women dropping out of it, and it's again, I think this is a societal problem generally.
It certainly is. One of the reasons we're doing these kinds of research now and focusing on these sort of issues is because of the effect on society, isn't it?
Yeah.
Nick makes this point, which is a good one. The problem is multifaceted and systemic. Until that is recognised, not just by those in the industry, but also by society more generally, I fear that we will not succeed in attracting and retaining more women, you mentioned specifically to the
I
industry.
think that's a very important point.
It is.
It is a societal and systemic problem.
Yeah. So here's a question that we had through our little system here. What work has been done to understand the demographic of BCS membership? It will be interesting to understand how representative the organisation is of society.
That's interesting. That's an interesting question. We are actually working at a system where we're going to capture diversity data for members as we go along. So we are changing our IT systems, putting in place some more requirements for new members as well as existing members, that we will be asking members to provide diversity data so that we can have some ideas to the diversity spread of our members in future. So work is going on at the moment.
Yeah, that's a relevant question, isn't it? Thierry Ackerman has just asked, will you share the presentation with the participants? I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. Of course we will. As I mentioned earlier, we will also do a follow-up blog on some of the issues that have been raised here. Naseer mentioned to me that he has some other resources that are worth sharing, so we can follow up with another blog post there. Sam Harper has asked, what is included as any minority?
As you know, Britain is a very diverse place, and there are hundreds and hundreds of different communities living. I mean, in the country. I mean, if you go to London, for example, and go to schools in London, some schools have over 100 different languages spoken by children attending those schools. So you can imagine the number of communities those children coming from. So it's a very diverse and wide range of communities that we are talking about, and that includes, Eastern European minority communities as well as non-white communities from African, Asian community countries.
Excellent. Thanks for all the questions, folks. There's more coming in. Louise Nixon asked this: what are the best practices to avoid stereotyping?
I think the best thing to do is actually, first of all, your systems and your policies have to be very clear as to what is the organizational stance on equality, diversity, and you have to have a level of zero tolerance, if you like, against discrimination. But also, people within the organizations need to be trained and equipped to be able to understand their own prejudices and be aware of those prejudices, so that when they are actually dealing with people in a diverse team, so that they understand that they are actually aware of their own prejudices, so that they don't actually discriminate against any members of their own teams. And it's important to be trained and skilled, because you can't expect people to actually just know everything about diversity.
Absolutely.
You need to actually ensure that, like anything else, people need to have education levels which are really at the highest level.
So in the age of big data and data mining and finding out personal information, the follow-up question from Louise is a good one. What are your thoughts on how to measure inclusion?
Again, I mean, I think there are different levels, different ways of measuring, depending where you're based. For example, if you're based in London, you're comparing your staffing levels with a very diverse community out there, and where your catchment area is. If you are in, for example, Norwich, the level of your catchment area in terms of diversity is very different. So you have to be basically aware of your catchment area in terms of, when you're recruiting, how many people from different communities are you actually targeting. And again, it is important to be aware that even small numbers are quite important. I mean, you can't ignore people just because there are only few within your organization. You have to treat individuals with fairness and respect, regardless of how many you've got from different communities.
Absolutely. Sydney Vera has posted in, is it possible to get a copy of the full report? It is indeed. It's on bcs.org. I think it's /diversity. It's available there as a PDF. We have some hard copies. There's a large print version. There's also an audio version if you prefer to listen to it as well. I'm told that the PDF version is not as accessible as it could be, so we will be working on that to make sure that it is. Another question here. What can you do when you see implicit discrimination at work?
Challenge it. I mean, the only way people are going to change is when you actually educate people about their behavior. So if you stay quiet and don't challenge behavior which is unacceptable, then it will just carry on. So you need to challenge it in a constructive way. Don't confront it in a kind of in a way which makes things worse. But challenge it in a constructive way. Talk to people who you think are behaving in a discriminatory way, and explain to them. And if they still carry on, then obviously your organization should have systems in place, policies in place that actually deals with that kind of situation.
Thanks. Sam Harper has a suggestion here. Name, age, and sex should be hidden when looking at job applications.
I think, yeah, some organizations already do that, but I think that actually does work quite well. But the problem is that obviously when you're interviewing people, you can't actually hide them. So, and at that level, prejudice can also actually kind of crop up, and people can make subjective, judgments about people being interviewed. And that's where you need to be aware of whether you are looking at the objective abilities and skills that the person is bringing to the job, or are you looking at the kind of the stereotyped image that you might hold of that particular group of people.
Lovely. Well, thank you for your answers, Naseer. We've had plenty of questions. There's some more there. We will address some of those privately, and we will follow up with a blog, as we mentioned earlier. So I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. This will be available, this webinar, in various formats. It just leaves me to say thank you, first of all, to Naseer, and also just to highlight our next Key Insights webinar. The topic will be the business and tech challenges of 2018. It will be based on our recent research that we've done of digital leaders and the views that they have. Some interesting things that are keeping them awake at night, so listen out for that one. And we'll have some people invited along to that. That's the 21st of March, 2018. Thank you very much. If you have any comments, please feel free to email me or leave them on the comment section here on our GoToWebinar site. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.